I think we would like to start because it's quite a short session. We only have about an hour, and what we would like to do is to be able to have a conversation on really getting a sense of everyone's experiences and also thoughts and ideas about what it takes to establish a kind of multi-stakeholder process to engage on internet governance policy discussions in our different contexts and in our different countries. And maybe you've had this experience before that you can bring to the table, or if you have questions or kind of like, analysis or insights, we would be happy to hear them. So the session is primarily organized and divided into two segments. The first segment is basically inputs, brief inputs and commentary from four discussants. They are Wathshlah Naidu, Ming-Kuok from UNESCO, Liza Garcia from Foundation for Media Alternative, and also Dobby from SUARAM, Rakyat, Malaysia. So I will actually allow them to, I will actually facilitate space for them to introduce themselves. But after their sort of brief input, we would hopefully open it up for much broader conversation between everyone. So please, as you can see, the chat is open. So please feel free to use the chat to also, have a side conversation with each other. Keep it, keep it as open and as communicative as you would like it to be. And then we will hopefully have at least 30 minutes for that conversation, if not longer. And so, yeah, with that, let's start the session. So let's start with maybe just a round of introduction to all the discussants. If you can take a moment to kind of give yourself a brief introduction to everyone. Starting with you, Wathshlah.
Sorry, I was just still muted. Thank you, Jack, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm Wathshlah Naidu from the Center for Independent Journalism, Malaysia. We focus on freedom of expression, free media, and right to information. Thank you.
Thanks, Wathshlah. Ming-Kuok?
Thank you, Jack. And good day to everybody. My name is Ming-Kuok Lim. I'm the Communication and Information Advisor for the UNESCO office based in Jakarta, which is a regional office covering several countries in Southeast Asia.
Thanks very much, Ming-Kuok. Liza?
Yes, thanks, Jack. Good afternoon. Good day, everyone. I'm Liza Garcia from the Foundation for Media Alternatives. Based in the Philippines, we're not a media organization, but we work with individuals and groups and other stakeholders on issues relating to digital rights, gender, internet governance, privacy, and data protection. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And finally, Dobby.
Hi, I'm Dobby. I'm the program manager at SUARAM. We are a human rights NGO that works mainly on civil and political rights in Malaysia.
You also have the best background so far. I love those pandas. They're great. Okay, so Wathshlah, would you like to take us off, like just sort of frame like the issue and the conversation? What is it that we are aiming to have a conversation about today, really?
Well, we're basically looking at Malaysia's experiences and contextualizing some of the discussion in terms of what we've gone through. And we are hoping that from this session, we would have some good practices that we can model some of our processes and trying to work with, especially our government, and trying to institutionalize our multi-stakeholder processes in terms of taking forward the discussions on internet governance. So if we're looking at what's happening in Malaysia, I mean, we're facing unprecedented crisis, not just COVID, but we've seen interesting political, I would say, transitions. The first transition in May 2018, which really didn't last too long. It did open up some spaces, but we saw another political crisis which took place in February this year, which actually brought back the previous kleptocratic government to power. So in that context, I mean, over the last few years, we have attempted to institutionalize, or at least initiate some discussions on a national multi-stakeholder collaboration in terms of promoting internet governance. Between 2014 and 2017, under the old Barisan National Government, there were several attempts, 2 attempts at least, to have a national forum, mainly led by academics and the government, which did not institutionalize a multi-stakeholder process, nor did it have extensive engagement from the civil society. However, last year we saw, some opening of doors where we were able to directly engage with some ministers, particularly from the Ministry of Communications and Multimedia. So there was interesting conversations going. They were willing to engage with us. They were trying to understand, but what was very clear was one very limited understanding of the necessity or even the positive elements of having a multi-stakeholder process, because the focus has always been on technology, infrastructure, and even access, but very rarely has been the focus on human rights or framing it within a human rights framework. So within that context, we initiated discussion. And we were moving forward despite the need to establish trust and relationship. Although there was a commitment to move forward on a multi-stakeholder process, there was willingness to engage on a digital rights discussion, or to sort of initiate a digital rights forum. So there was that level or that momentum we were building towards between November to February. And then February happened with a change in government and with the increase in COVID. What we saw was further limiting of spaces of freedom of expression. The crackdown on dissenting voices, dissenting opinion. There's also proliferation of hate speech or hate narrative, and also this kind of a concerted propaganda towards fake news or disinformation to sort of set the framework in terms of the government rhetorics, right? We also saw, or we are continuing to see, the increase in surveillance, increase in censorship, and some of these increase in censorship also, of course, it includes disproportionate responses, including criminalization, of certain acts. We are also seeing, of course, it's the written or the continued priorities of the government where it's always the technology and it's always the discussion on who's going to get the access and who's got the best access. So what we would like to have today is how do we move forward in this context, where content regulations increased. We have seen the reluctance to frame any discussion within a human rights context or human rights framework. And there is increasing, or I would say, how there is more crackdown and increasing limitation in terms of civic spaces. So that's setting the context for us today, and we really hope to have this conversation. How can we learn from the experiences across the region, and what would be a kind of a model that we can sort of pursue and replicate here in Malaysia? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wathshlah. And I think kind of the challenging context that COVID is bringing and kind of the increased role of the state in trying to maintain kind of civic space in terms of information and in terms of engagement is one that is maybe possibly shared by most, many people in the region. I guess a question also for everyone who is here, when you have the, as different people are speaking, it would be good to get a sense if who amongst the participants here have had an experience in engaging with the national multi-stakeholder internet governance process or dialogue. If you can just say that in the chat, that will help us to also get a sense of who's in the room. Meanwhile, Ming, maybe we can turn to you and you can talk to us a little bit more about why is multi-stakeholder approach such a big deal? Why is that important? Can it not be led by, say, more traditionally, like just by the states or by the government or by civil society, maybe? I'll pass that to you.
Thank you, Jack. And thank you also for inviting UNESCO to be part of this discussion. I'll try today to make the linkage between internet and human rights, as well through what we call a multi-stakeholder collaboration, and which is one of UNESCO's main approach to addressing this issue. That is why UNESCO consider forums such as IGF or the regional forum, the Asia Pacific region IGF, as important outcomes of the WSIS, the WSIS outcomes. That and so much so that we also have hosted one of the main IGFs in Paris back in 2018. The main cause of that is because the multi-stakeholder approach of IGF enables a wide-ranging discussion to take place in a collaborative atmosphere, and it facilitates debates and arguments and agreements. So we thought and we find over the years that this is very enriching to the whole process, and the final product is always better through a multi-stakeholder approach, especially something as complicated as internet and the freedom of expression and access to information, which of course today is also the International Day for the Universal Access to Information. So this topic is very timely. I like to highlight one of the most recent policy tool introduced by UNESCO, which is a beautiful example of a multi-stakeholder model that can be replicated in at the country level, which is called the Internet Universality. The Internet Universality concept and its accompanying indicators, the Internet Universality indicators, was officially launched last year, but it was a result of a consultation at the multi-stakeholder level that included 2,000 over experts and consultation that took place in 32 different countries, as well as the consultation that took place in the headquarters in Paris with the permanent delegations and member states over nearly 2 years. So the outcome of 2 years of consultation with over 2,000 experts is this Internet Universality. And what it is a set of principles, 4 principles that we acronym ROAM, R-O-A-M. So which stands for how we need to guide the process of the internet moving forward. That the internet has to be based on human rights, R. That it has to be open for all, O. That it has to be accessible, A. And that the governance of the internet must be based on a multi-stakeholder approach. So ROAM, Rome principles. And in fact, we find that the Rome principles and the Internet Universality concept is strong enough that we can actually now apply it to the understanding of artificial intelligence, which some of you may know the UNESCO is currently again conducting a multi-stakeholder consultation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And that is also based on the multi-stakeholder approach. So all of this is to say that we have done this, we have been doing this, and it is something that we have seen being replicated in different countries, even at the country level. So we hope that this can be a model and a template for countries that wish to embark on this multi-stakeholder approach to discuss the future of the internet and freedom of expression. Back to you, Jackie.
Thanks very much. Yeah, the UNESCO Universality Index is a really cool thing, actually, and I've been also following that process. So maybe we can also get a sense of possibly some other people in the room who may have also encountered this and engaged with it in some ways. And there's also an open question there in the chat box, which is a question to the room. What is your experience of engaging in multi-stakeholder IG policy dialogue processes, especially nationally? So feel free to take your time whenever to sort of just pop that in. Next, let's hear from Liza. I think, Liza, you've been doing some of this work for at least, engaging in national processes for at least 5 years now. And you were mentioning earlier that this year there was supposed to be the first national IGF process until COVID.
Yes.
So talk to us, yes, more about this. Yeah.
Okay. I think for my organization, at least the Foundation for Media Alternatives, we've been engaging in the process even without a national process yet. As early as I think when the IGF was held in Egypt, I think I wasn't with FMA during that time yet, but I think some of our staff were already attending the process. So anyway, as early as March 2015, actually, we started an initiative to create a Philippine Declaration of Internet Rights and Principles. So what we did was to have a workshop where we invited representatives from different sectors, civil society, you have the academia, and also government was there as well, people's organizations. So that was workshop that we did. I think we were inspired, of course, by the multi-stakeholder approach. The year before, in 2014, they just finished the Net Mundial in Brazil. So that was an inspiration for us. And it was also during that year, I think even APC, the feminist principles of the internet, have started during that time already. And we were inspired by those things that were happening. So we wanted also to create something for the Philippines. What is the internet that we as Filipinos want to have? So we started the process, so the workshop, and then afterwards, when we were able to draft something already, there was a team that was looking at it. We posted it online to get some feedback from netizens, and then we also had consultations. I think we had 2 consultations in 2 regions of the country where we invited also some experts there. So we're getting also input and insights from people who are not in the metropolis in Metro Manila. And finally, in November of the same year, we launched it at the office of the then Department of Science and Technology office of ICT office. We didn't have a Department of ICT yet during that time, but that was where we launched it, and they were interested actually in the document that we came up with. Of course, they couldn't sign the declaration that we had, because if you're government, then you need a lot of paperwork. But they were aware of it, and they were, well, I suppose they were supportive of it because we held it in their office building. Yeah, since then, we have continued to be active in the process, the multi-stakeholder process. And in 2016, actually, was it 2016? Yeah, I think we had with the Department of ICT already. It was already established. So we had a colloquium on internet governance. So it was a 2-day activity with our Department of ICT, because we continue engaging our, at least this government agency that we have. And then we also collaborated with Internet Society, the Philippines chapter. And I guess we were just, we kept the conversation with them. So every year, whenever there are processes, hey, are you attending this process? Are you attending APRIGF? Are you attending IGF? We were like that with them. No, we were not bullying them, but we kept on asking them, are you attending this? This is good. This might be good. Because I think most government offices then don't really attend the IGF, this process. They would rather attend meetings at the ITU level, maybe because it's the results are non-binding. But we told them that this is something that we can learn. This is important for us. So by 2018, I think, 2018, FMA was able to get some funds. So what we did was to approach again the Internet Society and then our Department of ICT, and we said, hey, we have this money. We want to have this and the internet governance in the Philippines, a national one. But before that, we wanted to engage a lot of people, not just the usual suspects, in the urban area. So what we did was to have a road show where we went to the different provinces. I think we were able to go to 4 different areas in the country, invited people. In some places, we had more than 100, I think, in almost all of the places. And that was, we started the conversation with the different stakeholders in the different regions, because these are voices that we haven't heard. So it was a good process. We actually wanted to have, after the road show, we wanted to have a national IGF to bring together all these, stakeholders. But COVID-19 happened, so maybe we'll postpone it some other time.
Thanks very much, Lisa. So it sounds like it's really a long and persistent road from 2013 until 2020, and lots of different kinds of engagement. And I think you also touched on some of the things that's coming out in the chat, which is the lack of familiarity with some of the issues, either by government or by different stakeholders. There's also, I think there's this one conversation that's really interesting about everybody coming in and talking a different language. So there's diversity between stakeholders, and then there's also the need for diversity within, amongst stakeholders. And then how do we also talk about the same thing, but coming in from different points of view? So that's, yeah, let's maybe aim to have a conversation about that once this part of the session is, yeah. So Dobby, where do we go from here? Now that, yeah, now that there's all of these different overviews.
Well, for Malaysia, we're not going anywhere anytime soon. And all the Malaysian colleagues starts laughing. We were caught in quite an interesting time because we had the first change of a government through a democratic process, and that brought about a lot of different things. Different in a new sense, not just to us, but also to the government itself. Because previously, I think the whole idea of having a stakeholder engagement alone was quite alien to both the government. And because the government was so reluctant to have this kind of engagement, even civil society were very ill-equipped to deal with it. So when the whole IGF topic came around for us, it gave a unique opportunity where we have something that most stakeholders, including the government, academia, tech companies, were aware of such a process, but getting people together was the big tricky question that we had. And the fact that you haven't seen the official Internet Governance Forum in Malaysia kind of already gives you a prelude to how well the discussion went. But we made early headways to get everyone sat down together at the table to kind of agree to some basic ideas, some basic principle. But unfortunately, things didn't work out for us. And then COVID-19 came about and things definitely did not work out for anyone around the world, I think. So that's kind of the reality we deal with nowadays. But the bigger national IGF aside, we still managed to get something like a youth IGF going on. And that itself really highlights some of the challenges or the unique challenges that we have. Malaysia, even though we're not a big country, we have quite a big rural-urban divide, not only because of financial wealth or connections, but the distance itself. We have two Borneo states which are essentially as big as the landmass that our capital has, and all of them has very different or distinct access to the internet and how they deal with the government and the whole kind of other mess around that. So we're kind of in this position where we have to engage as effectively as we can to reach out to an audience that have a very different life experience, especially when it comes to their life on the internet and how they want to deal with it on a policy level. So reaching out to them and being able to get them on board was a challenge, to say the least. But how to institutionalize it, from what we can see so far, or at least in the youth side of the IGF, having an anchor organization or organization that can be an anchor at the regional level to bring it up to a national level is really critical. Like in our case, what we did was to engage as much as we can with university and lecturers who can act as an anchor point for students, or local youth organization that can act as a focal point for youth to bring youth in, to find interest among youth, to kind of drive them towards this process if they're interested, and just kind of build this kind of little small building block. And at the national level for the non-youth IGF, not to say the old people IGF, but the older generation IGF, how do we recreate that process? That's a good question. We have had ample amount of discussion on that in Malaysia, but so far none of it has actually taken form. So it's something that we also like to explore and see, especially from a participant from different countries. How do you guys deal with it? And what worked best for you guys? So things that we can learn and move forward from there for Malaysia also. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Dobby. And there's lots of like kind of quite rich things that has been brought to the table that, both touches upon some of the challenges that are being faced. In particular, I think some of the challenges that are named, these challenges of engaging with probably the government, in terms of them, one of the issues being it's a lack of familiarity. The other, which was really interesting that came up in the chat, is sometimes the government is anxious about engaging with the multi-stakeholder process because they're worried about being named and shamed. And therefore, something that has the principles of multi-stakeholderism, openness, and open dialogue, it's a different kind of a policy culture, maybe that's like just have to be a bit wary. What does this mean? Not really wanting to kind of commit to anything beforehand, not being, how do we have a policy dialogue without commitments, but still able to also share this in an open way? And then multi-stakeholder meaning different things to very different people. And that one of the things that's being discussed is how to talk technology to policymakers and how to talk policy to technology developers. And I think there's also like a multiplicity of diversity within that, like how to talk, say, for example, feminism to human rights people, how to talk human rights to kind of development, and all these different kind of like bridges that comes across. And then the big urban and rural divide is quite significant. So we could hear from Liza the immense amount of outreach work that had to be done through the years to kind of engage and you know, sort of work around engagement. And then finally, the reality of COVID. I mean, this is where we are right now. And COVID, I think, you know, it's also an interesting moment where lots of different kinds of policy infrastructure is being deployed. And I'm not sure if it's being accompanied by adequate policy discussion and especially around implications long-term and immediate around from a human rights framework. So this is where we're at. I'm actually not sure if maybe the people from .asia will be able to tell me if participants can take the mic or if the chat box is the best place to go. But I guess one thing that would be really good question that, yeah, that Sohaib is actually asking, are there any best examples of national governments engaging with other stakeholders? So are there, maybe just to get a sense from the rich experience in the room, in terms of how you have engaged with different stakeholder groups, doesn't matter which group you're in or from, what do you feel has really worked? If you can just signal and keep your interventions fairly brief, because we only have half an hour left to this session, if not less. So yeah. Anyone would like to just kind of like share a little bit about your experience? You can take the mic. There you go. If you have a question or comment, please raise a hand. Okay.
Hello, this is Ashraful from Bangladesh. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you so much. So I have an issue. I want to raise these issues about the stakeholder issues. I want to say about the rural communities and versus the urban communities access, the based on their internet access or internet speeds. Here, my concern is the difference between the urban and rural areas connection based on their speed. It's a huge gap, I think. I think it's not only a local issues; it's the global issues based on our Asia's region. Where we talking about the digital tools connectivity. So here is considerable issues. As a peer professionals, I had opportunity to visit many rural areas. So I think it's my concern that the mainstream community with the rural communities has a huge gap, because still they did not connect with us. The how we can already connected. I think the mainstream community they can also contribute the GDP if we can connect them. Because we can talk about the youth community or the youth engagement, but still there is a large community. What I about to say is the rural community. All right. So can we take any initiative from our IGF or AIGF for them with the collaborate with the local government?
Thanks, Ashraf. Sorry, Ashrafur. Yeah.
Yes. Please.
I think that's a really good point. There is, I think, different. So we often think about the government as kind of this monolithic central government, but the point that's being raised here is there's also kind of distributed, much more local forms of governance and government institutions and processes. So possibly that's another way to think about it, rather than sort of, you know, I think often civil society do tend to, because of resource stretch or so on, or, you know, because of the concentration of processes and institutions in urban centers, we sort of maybe don't think about as much around engagement with local governments and local governance. That's an interesting point. Does anybody want to maybe speak to that or have an idea or an experience around that? And if you did, this question from Sohaib is also really great. Like, what frameworks have you used for such an engagement?
I want to add another issue.
Sorry, Asrafur.
Yes, please.
Because we don't have a lot of time, do you mind if we just kept your intervention as that, and then let's see if there's more time, and then if we can give you more space. Is that okay?
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let's see. I'm also reading here on the chat, bridging the digital divide between urban and rural is something that Ashirod is very interested in. Okay, so there you go. There's like some side conversations that can take place. Research on ICT after Nepal earthquake. Yeah, access is definitely a big issue and possibly a door opening issue that can be discussed with governments in particular, no, to bring in them. And it's also a really interesting conversation that can bring in lots of different kinds of stakeholder groups into the discussion, because access is not something that can be resolved primarily just by one stakeholder. It necessarily requires multiple different stakeholders to really participate in very actively. Opening the floor. I can't actually see if anyone's raising your hands. So I'm sort of trusting the moderator to be able to see.
We have got one hand from Manju, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Manju from Taiwan. I guess I can share about how our government kind of created this multi-stakeholder engagement forum. Our digital minister actually introduced this morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone, about how we created this mass map during in the very early age of COVID-19. They practically just open data to anyone engineering who wants to, access the data, and they can locate all the pharmacies in Taiwan and then show how many masks are there still, the supply of the masks of the pharmacy. And so you can check the map on your app. And there's so many different apps because all kinds of engineers are working their best to, create the best map. So you can, just go to the App Store and download any kinds of apps, and you can see the map, and you don't have to go to this pharmacy because the mask supply is already out of stock, and you could go to the other pharmacy to check if there's still masks. But I think one of our problems in Taiwan is that all this kind of multi-stakeholder engagement is really tech-oriented. So you see what I was talking, it was multi-stakeholder, but mostly it was the tech people, the engineering people who are involved, and all us end user, we really just, leave a comment on the map or, not really involved in this. So I think that's a good example of, how the government is opening up access and data to create this multi-stakeholder engagement. But also it's only from one aspect, really only focusing on the tech community, and the public policy community is not really involved. So I think we can improve. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Manju. I was just going to ask, the kind of policy environment that will be needed for such, such an application to be really useful. So it requires, obviously, cooperation between pharmaceuticals to share their data. Maybe there is an open data kind of a policy environment that also at the same time protects, allows for transparency, but also sort of defends the use of privacy. And it's interesting to see that users are being seen primarily as consumers or as users of the technology rather than as sort of active contributor to the framework, for example, or usability and so forth. But this is an interesting moment, so let's see what happens from that. James, I think you have your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm from Internet NZ. Well, I work at Internet NZ, which is a civil society and technical organization with the top-level country code domain registry for NZ. And we also do public good and policy work. And in terms of the models for multi-stakeholder engagement, there's a couple of things that I'd like to share. One is sort of a shift in our approach. So historically, we were very much focused on responding to government-led processes. In New Zealand, that means often officials putting something out for consultation, and we would write submissions. And over the past few years, we've moved to a model of kind of providing a conversation platform for the public. So with discussion of contact tracing technologies and of a charter for governance and government use of algorithms, we used Zoom conversations. Lockdown helped with motivating that. And before COVID-19 was well known, kind of Twitter conversation. So we're trying to present a range of perspectives from people in the public to government. Those are things that I'm more familiar with, and I think that's been somewhat effective, just in raising awareness of that possibility of that conversation. The other thing which I have less direct knowledge of is the New Zealand government's interest in the Christchurch call and making that a process that has some participation for civil society organizations in the government to government space as well.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that sort of speaks to kind of the current context as both an opportunity for engaging in conversation as well, and maybe similar to what Liza was doing with the roadshows, no, sort of creating a process for discussion around content, like a very pertinent policy issues that will impact us on our everyday, which everybody is affected right now by COVID, whether or not you are connected to the internet. I guess the challenge is, given that we are all distributed, then access becomes a big issue, which was the point that Ashrafur was bringing up earlier. Dr. Govind, you have your hands up.
Thank you. My question is really that, we have traveled a long distance in the internet governance and multi-stakeholder model way back from 2006.
Sorry, can you speak from where you are from? Just a little bit of, yeah.
Yeah, I am from India, right now based in Delhi. So my question is really the internet governance, multi-stakeholderism, how this is changing with the changing time, because the IGF first held in Athens in 2006, and today we are in 2020. Whether the multi-stakeholder model needs to be seen in a different way post-COVID, or the more, dominant role of private sector is also coming up more and more compared to the governments. So how we are seeing the variation in the multi-stakeholder model of various stakeholders versus government, private sector, and civil society?
That's a really good point. Like when we talk about multi-stakeholder, who are the different stakeholders do we mean? No, and is there what are some of the more dominant kind of different institutions that we also have to engage with? It's definitely much bigger than these three slices of pie that we put forward: civil society, technical, private sector, and four sides of pie, and then the government. There's definitely a lot more diversity between and within. Does anyone else from the panelists want to kind of jump in and also give an input? Now that we have a lull in hands. Go ahead, Wathshlah.
I think it's a really interesting point in terms of looking at everybody's agenda, the different stakeholders and their agenda. In Malaysia, what we have experienced is, in our conversation with government, obviously there's that reluctance to go beyond the usual infrastructure access discussion, right? The moment we start couching it in human rights language, there is either lack of understanding or lack of commitment or willingness to continue with that discussion. On the other hand, we've also obviously had discussions with different other stakeholders, including social media platform owners, right? We've had the discussions with Facebook and Twitter, but again, the priorities vary. So bringing together these players into the same platform is a challenge because, what are their focus? So for us, the question has always been, what would be that one common agenda that's going to help us to take the policy conversation forward? Because that's where we are always caught, because most of our conversations with Facebook or Twitter is that, yes, we are willing to come and engage, but make sure the government is on board. So now it's how do we bridge these gaps and this requests and requirement and agendas? So that's where we are stuck as well. I mean, we're having a government that's not going to engage, or that's at least in the near future. So how do we move forward? How do we rethink this multi-stakeholder engagement for us here in Malaysia?
What a big question you asked, no? How do we rethink multi-stakeholder engagement? Well, I think there's some really good examples or ideas that's been put forth in terms of thinking about it more as a gradual thing and as a phased thing, that it's not always necessary that the government is the first point of contact. I think maybe that's something that's coming up right now. And that I think the other thing that's coming up is not everybody sort of knows a little bit of everything and maybe not And like, you know, this is, I think this is the magic and the necessity of a multi-stakeholder process and engagement. It is to bring all of these different levels of deep expertise, but partial, into the same space to discuss something that affects us all. And I maybe want to bring this back to 2020. It is the year of a global pandemic. Can public health policy issues be something that pulls us together to think about, actually, we do have a common agenda. We all want to be able to address this issue, and we know that technology has a role to play. We know that public health surveillance is one of the things that actually helps in a pandemic such as this, and technology has a role to play in relation to this. But we are also very aware that once infrastructure is laid down, it's very difficult to roll back. Second is, we know that in this region, there's, I'm not sure, but there's probably very patchy realities in terms of existing policy safeguards to think about, you know, how do we roll this out in a way that makes sure that our rights in the future is not compromised. In also the context of there's additional realities that's coming in terms of algorithmic decision making and so forth. And yeah, so can this be a point of coalescing? What do you think? Now we're just kind of open speculating now. We're not sort of looking towards experiences, but maybe looking towards ideals and dreams. Like, what is the ideal scenario for you in your context to be able to have this conversation as a multi-stakeholder one, or not? If you think that this conversation should not be done in a multi-stakeholder way, who should have this conversation and how? Yeah, speculation time. It is open. Okay, Ming-Kuok.
Since we are talking about speculation and in the ideal scenario, so regardless of how we approach or whether multi-stakeholders, the very definition of multi-stakeholder approach is changing due to COVID or not, there are certain characteristics of a multi-stakeholder approach that should be there regardless. They should be inclusive, they should be diverse, they should be collaborative, they should be transparent, since transparency is one of the things that's lacking in a lot of discussion process, equal, well-informed, but flexible at the same time, and there has to be an accountability there. So these are some of those criteria, characteristics of a multi-stakeholder approach that, whether it is changing or not, should always be there in order to be effective in the end. So perhaps those are some of the, we can look at the nature and the characteristic of it, rather than some vague definition of what we think it means. Like back to what you have said in the beginning, people have different definition of multi-stakeholderism. Back to you, Jackie.
Yeah, thanks very much for outlining some of the key principles, regardless of what we're talking about. These are some of the key principles that we would like to be able to adhere to. They're all really good principles, but I think even one of them, like let's say inclusive, even that sort of one specific, that's a whole process in itself that we also need to like sort of think through, inclusive in what way and how and when. And I think the whole question around sort of existing gaps is one that we do need to take into consideration. There is a question from Zin Myo. Sorry, I'm very bad. I think I might be mangling your name. Ted. I would like to ask one question. Apologies, I can't ask directly because of technical error. In Myanmar, during this election time, there is so many hate speech and misinformation on social media by the party supporters. So the problem is that it may harm internet users, and sometimes it will lead to bad outcomes. Myanmar government has no digital law clearly, and sometimes central government arrests some persons on social media. So how can Myanmar develop strong digital laws by collaborating with stakeholders, different stakeholders, I think, yeah. So I think maybe the question around, so we've been talking about access and the need for access to the internet for policy, kind of like public policy issues. But then there is at the other end what Wathshlah also raised in the very beginning, which is we are in a situation where there is also quite overt and active repression that's happening in different, that's coming through in different contexts, and sometimes also quite active kind of like regulation and control by the government itself on what happens on the internet in terms of free speech and so on. So what is how is this environment conducive to even think about a multi-stakeholder process? why is that critical and how? No, and I think especially in Myanmar, the reality is very sobering. And I wish that Kin was here, because I think they did do this really. I think Mido and another organization, name escapes me right now, has done a very really interesting digital rights forum national process that tries to bring together that does bring together different stakeholder groups to talk about internet governance and internet policy issues, especially with the genocide that happened, and where Facebook played a big role in that in Myanmar. So if anyone can sort of share or speak to that, that will also be helpful. Our session ends in 15 minutes. I got a very kind reminder. Was that you, Dobby? Yeah, please.
I find the question very interesting, because I think that's the exact same thing that we go through in Malaysia. And it's also the same question, like how do we even engage the Malaysian government back in 2018 or even before that? How do we even engage with them in any conversation? But from the few years that we've dealt with, because we have very similar, not to say laws, but very similar practices with our state and social media comments online. Arrest, prosecution is quite common here also. I think the only way they can move forward is to try and find some degree of common ground. If the government is open to it, that's the easiest way forward. But more often than not, they're probably not in our context. But sometimes you can find the odd allies in tech giants or even social media companies, sometimes, not all the time. Because they might have a complete different sense of what's driving them or what do they want to see in policy development. But sometimes there is an overlap and they both disagree with something. We both disagree with something, and that disagreement can be carried to government through our own individual channel. And once, everyone in the stakeholder kind of knows that we're all on the same page on this issue, it becomes a lot easier for you to kind of push for stakeholder consultation and engagement. So as an example, in Malaysia, what really drove a lot of the different groups of tech community or us and media coming together, I think, was when our government introduced an anti-fake news act. It's problematic to freedom of expression on our end. It's problematic for legal liabilities on the company's end, and it's problematic for media company because the nature of the law was so vague. And in that case, I think that gave us enough momentum to meet with all these different groups, pull everyone together to have a consultation and just talk about it. And this was before the government even has a stakeholder process on IGF. So I think when you find tidbits or opportunity like that, you can always exploit it and use it to the fullest. Because anti-fake news or fake news might be one thing that bring you together, but once you're in the same room, it becomes very easy to have a lot of other conversation. Another example on similar things, I was at a forum on fake news with so happened with this guy from the Ministry of Communication Multimedia, well, one of their subdivision kind of thing. And we're just talking to him, and then we kind of realized there's some common points of concern that we have. They are looking for a better way to deal with revenge porn. And this is something that clearly on civil society side, we would not object to such a regulation. It would be happy to kind of discuss with them to kind of how to work out a mechanism for that. And, once you meet, this kind of conversation start churning and becomes more likely or slightly more realistic that you can have a conversation and hopefully build towards that direction of a stakeholder engagement. Yeah, thanks.
And also hopefully with kind of like the stakeholders who are directly engaged, impacted or have been working on this issue, on non-consensual. So basically what I'm saying is make sure the feminists are on the table. I think, but actually I'm quite curious to see if there are any participants who are from the government or from the public, from the state, like state representative who are amongst us, who can also speak to maybe some of the challenges that you might have and some of the ways in which you have engaged with this issue of trying to have discussion with different stakeholder groups, some of the barriers and limitations. Is there anyone from state or government in this conversation? Or maybe public official in some ways, because I think it's also, I think that's the beauty of a process like APRIGF and a process like IGF is really an ability for us to get outside of our own bubble and our own kind of priorities, to be able to kind of also be very consciously aware that we may be coming in from a very specific perspective, but there's many at play. And how do we also take an opportunity like this conversation to talk through some of that differences and what that could be. I think there was a discussion earlier about the challenge of talking tech to policymakers and talking policy to tech developers? Does anyone who was having that conversation, do you want to like kind of speak a little to that in terms of your experience? Stakeholder engagement can be done by both active and passive in parallel. Finding that common ground on an issue or two helps to build dialogue on different matters, and working collectively directed to attain a greater total than the sum of individual contributions. So yeah, it's really about moving outside of our own narrow kind of stakeholder concerns. And I know that's also very challenging for me as an activist. I also have like, you know, quite a strong regard of where things should go. So we are on our last 10 minutes. I did open the floor for speculation, so we can also freely speculate at this moment and create like what we think is possible or imaginative. So any good examples from the Asia Pacific region where government has done good related to internet governance? I'm sure there are many examples of different governments doing, you know, or different stakeholders doing some level of good. Anyone from Indonesia who might want to speak to? Yeah, I see Indonesia being surfaced and propelled. Indonesia is interesting because there's a civil society group that played a very big role in the beginning to try and engage a multi-stakeholder process, and then sort of like, you know, facilitated that. I think it was a similar situation with Brazil as well. But we call lumrah-lumrah kehidupan, the ebbs and flows of life. Yeah, any participants from Indonesia or maybe even India, which also had a couple of national IG processes that you might want to share?
Jackie, if I could give one example of a very interesting and good practice from Indonesia, and that relates quite a bit on the previous questions about disinformation and misinformation as well. The coalition from civil society and the media have created something called Check Fakta, factcheck.com. And that was leading up to the previous general election, and it continues to function. And it served quite a useful feature in fact-checking all the political discourse that was happening around the election. And it has been highlighted as one of those good examples and good practices where coalitions of really a wide group of media that, you know, they are competitors in terms of business, but they came together to verify information, and that was very much appreciated. And it was also referred back by the politicians. So it's sort of become a positive feedback loop. And this is where the example of having a sort of an out-of-the-box collaboration, but has a much wider and long-lasting impact. So that could be one of the ways that go about. So be friends with non people who you wouldn't think in the first instance are your partners, you know.
Yeah, that's very good advice. Look for the unusual suspects. Couple of years, Bangladesh trying their best for youth engagement with limited resources, but also appreciate that. I think there's some also discussion around youth IGF and how young people are really critical stakeholders in this conversation, but then sometimes it's always delineated. There's IGF for, like, as Dobby says, you know, for the old people, and then there's IGF for the younger people. So what's happening here? Anyone from like a youth IGF would like to or who's been engaged with the youth IGF process would like to take the floor and speak a little on your experience or your insights?
Well, I will take the floor then. This is Jenna for the record. So I've been engaged in the Asia Pacific Youth IGF since 2018. And actually in this group chat, we have quite a few YIGF participant of this year. So that's the problem of, you know, me organize. That's my observations for organizing YIGF for 3 years. Sometimes young people, when they're engaged in YIGF, they have a lot to talk and they have lots of opinion. But when they join the the big event and the main event, then they hesitate and not to, you know, voice out their opinion. So that's the thing on how we can actually bring participation and our agenda together, and to encourage our young people to actually voice out their opinion in regional event or even the global event, and not to label themselves and lock themselves in their own bubble. Doing this youth RGF only, but because like what the other said in the chat earlier, youth is also one of the important stakeholder, and then their opinions matters. So I think that's from me. Or if someone from IGF would like to say something or share something, feel free to do so.
Space is yours. We have 4 minutes, but we can certainly create a little bit. Yes, Putri Amina, yes? No? Okay.
Jackie, may I put a plug in?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, you have 1 minute for your intervention. Go.
Oh, okay. I just want to contribute my opinion on getting youth into the participation of internet governance. This is just my first year of first time engaging with people from the internet governance world, and I think if the government or the private sectors or even the education as a stakeholder come down to the youth and let youth speak up and actually listen to us and give us the space to talk, then that will be very amazing and a good approach.
Yeah, space to have a conversation and also space to listen to each other. I think every stakeholder is kind of yearning for that, no? So that's the common ground here, regardless of whether you have why or not. Everyone's yearning to be heard and yearning to speak. Let's see. Was there another? I think I heard another voice. If not, we can...
A multi-stakeholder model.
Give a quick plug.
Yes, okay, Aris.
Cross-pollination. Yeah. So in the name of promoting cross-pollination and inviting the non-traditional participants, we are doing a survey. I put the link in the chat on media information literacy. So it is one aspect of internet governance, but not a main aspect so far. So it's a platform for the youth. Feel free to join in, and I just put the link there. So hoping for some cross-pollination out of this discussion.
Great. Thanks, Ming. And I'll take that as your last intervention. Aris, did you still want to say something? If not, yeah?
Yeah, just an addition. Yeah, thank you. Just an addition. In the Philippines, we do have, actually locally in our institution, we do have this program. It's just an internal program wherein we expose students and making them on board in the discussions in IG. Actually, we have been attending APRIGF for the past 3 years, and all the results of that were part of the multi-stakeholder approach that was done with regards to building up the ICT policies in the country. And also, we also the youth that were
have to cut you off there.
Yeah, and the youth that were in the discussions previously were able to build programs, awareness programs to extend the IG discussions and IG awareness in the country. Yeah, thank you for the
amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that also cuts across a different point and speaks to some of the issues we discussed earlier, which is around some of us, we really also need to build our capacity to engage in the dialogue and to engage in the conversation. So there's need for space, there's need for dialogue, there's need for capacity, there's need for diversity and inclusion, and looking for that Venn diagram. So it's 1 minute, so let's have one last statement from maybe Dobby, Liza, and Wathshlah, and then thank you everyone for being so present into this session. So yeah, Dobby, you start.
Yeah, I think there was some interesting takeaway I didn't expect on the YIGF especially. And I think it's important to have that platform also in a sense, because it gives people an opportunity to sharpen their claws, so to speak. And youth, especially in Asia region where we are not taught to speak out, especially in front of our seniors, that practice, I think, is really crucial to make sure that they will voice out as a stakeholder at broader IGF. Thanks.
Thanks. Liza?
Yeah, I think we should continue the conversation, not just in spaces like the APRIGF and then the big spaces, at the national level. I am glad that there are many actually webinars, online discussions that are ongoing, and this touch on a lot of issues that we deal with here at the APRIGF. So let's just continue those conversations, even if we think that we're inundated already with the webinars.
Wathshlah, 10 seconds.
Very quickly, I think there are some very interesting takeaways here, and mainly I think we need to really talk about bridging the urban-rural divide, and also looking at exploring possibilities of engagement at different levels of government. That's something that we haven't really done. And of course, looking at different plugging on different entry points. Yeah, there's so many different things to take away. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to everyone for your insight, ideas, and also energy. We leave this being a little more hopeful than we came in. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone.